What if I told you the US military once built a secret nuclear city under Greenland's ice, imported camels to patrol the Arizona desert, mass-produced 1 million throwaway pistols to drop on Nazi-occupied Europe? And that's just the beginning. America built 111 jaw-dropping weapons your history teacher never told you about. Some vanished, some were buried, and some are still hidden in classified files right now. So before YouTube buries this video like the Pentagon buried these weapons, hit that subscribe button faster than a gyrojet rocket leaving the barrel. Because if you don't, somewhere out there a Cold War pigeon is judging you. Stick around. What's coming next is going to absolutely break your brain. 1. Picture this. The US Navy actually trained dolphins with sharp needles strapped to their heads to stab enemy combat divers during the Vietnam War. Yes, really. These cute flipper friends became underwater assassins swimming around like furry torpedoes with attitude. Sailors apparently watched in disbelief as Flipper transformed into a Cold War hitman. The Marine Mammal program still quietly operates in San Diego today. And somewhere out there, a dolphin is probably grinning, thinking about its glory days as America's most adorable killer. 2. Imagine America building 6,000 live bats strapped with tiny napalm capsules, ready to torch Japanese cities. Engineers genuinely believed this was a brilliant plan. During testing in 1943, a few sleepy bats escaped, flapped around confused, and accidentally burned down the entire Carlsbad Army airfield in New Mexico. Soldiers stood there watching their own base roast while the bats flew off cackling. The project was hush-hush, the bats were unbothered, and somewhere a general buried his face in shame. 3. Picture a serious Harvard psychologist named B.F. Skinner training actual pigeons to peck at little screens inside missile nose cones. Yes, real pigeons, guiding bombs by tapping glass like confused arcade gamers. The military funded this nonsense for 3 whole years before someone finally said enough in 1944. Generals reportedly watched the demo with straight faces while birds calmly pecked away. Project Pigeon died quietly, and somewhere in heaven a flock of patriotic pigeons is still waiting for their bronze medals and birdseed pensions. 4. Deep beneath Greenland's ice sheet, the US Army secretly carved out an entire city to hide 600 nuclear missiles from the Soviets. They called it Camp Century, but the real plan was Project Iceworm. Soldiers lived under the ice, ate dinner under the ice, and probably questioned every life choice under the ice. Then the project collapsed because shifting glaciers crushed it. Now its radioactive trash is leaking out as the ice melts, slowly reminding everyone what a terrible idea it was. 5. America once cranked out 1 million tiny single-shot Liberator pistols for $2.10 each, basically the IKEA furniture of guns. The plan was to airdrop them across Nazi-occupied Europe so civilians could ambush German soldiers. Each pistol came with comic book-style instructions because no words were needed. Most never made it to Europe and sat rotting in warehouses. Somewhere a French farmer probably opened a crate, looked inside, and asked who designed this little toy. 6. The gyrojet pistol fired tiny solid fuel rockets instead of regular bullets, making it the disco ball of firearms. It had 0 recoil, which sounded amazing on paper. The catch was that the rockets needed distance to actually speed up. So if a bad guy stood close, the bullets would just bonk him gently like a confused bumblebee. Soldiers tried it, scratched their heads, and quietly walked away. The gyrojet became a collector's curiosity and a permanent lesson in overcomplicating things. 7. In 1856, the US Army imported actual camels into America to form a real camel corps for desert patrol. Soldiers in Texas suddenly found themselves riding humped beasts that spit, groaned, and terrified every horse within a mile. The experiment fizzled out, but nobody bothered rounding up the camels. Wild descendants kept roaming Arizona deserts all the way until the 1940s, randomly scaring cowboys and ranchers. Imagine seeing a camel strolling through Arizona while sipping coffee on your porch. 8. In 1861, a guy named Ross Winans rolled out a bizarre steam-powered gun that allegedly used boiling water and spinning force to fling 200 rounds per minute. It looked like a coffee machine had a baby with a cannon. Confederate sympathizers loved it, journalists hyped it up, And then Union troops swooped in and yoinked the thing before it ever fired in combat. Engineers later admitted it probably never worked properly anyway. The Wenan steam gun became history's most overhyped kitchen appliance. 9. Imagine a soldier carrying a tiny nuclear bomb on a tripod like a vending machine of doom. That was the Davy Crockett, a man-portable nuke launched from a recoilless rifle. The hilarious flaw was that its radiation fallout zone was actually bigger than how far it could shoot. So basically, the operator would nuke himself first. Generals signed off on it anyway because the Cold War made everyone slightly insane. Troops trained with it, prayed about it, and quietly hoped to never use it. 10. The British built it, but Americans watched with popcorn as the Great Panjandrum rolled into history. It was a giant rocket-powered explosive wheel meant to blast through German bunkers on D-Day beaches. During the test, the wheel completely lost its mind, changed direction, and started chasing the spectators watching the demo. Generals scattered like cats, hearing a vacuum cleaner, while photographers ran for their lives. The wheel exploded harmlessly somewhere, and everybody pretended that day never happened. 11. Back in 1777, a doctor named Joseph Belton strolled into the Continental Congress with a 16-shot flintlock rifle, basically the world's first machine gun. He proudly demonstrated it expecting medals and money. Instead, Congress took one look, gasped, and called it too inhumane for warfare. Imagine being so cruel that even Revolutionary War guys thought you crossed the line. Belton walked out, broke and disappointed, while America stuck with single-shot muskets for another century. His invention vanished into history like an awkward cough. 12. In 1918, America built the Kettering bug, basically a wooden biplane drone packed with explosives. It was the country's first ever cruise missile, designed to fly itself into German trenches like a kamikaze pigeon. Engineers worked frantically to perfect it. Then World War I politely ended right before it could be deployed. Generals stared at hundreds of finished drones and asked, what now? The bug never killed anyone, never saw combat, and quietly retired to dusty warehouses where moths probably enjoyed nesting inside its wooden wings. 13. Imagine this. Allied engineers seriously planned to build a 2,000-foot aircraft carrier made entirely from frozen seawater mixed with sawdust. They called the magical ice goo Pykrete and named the project Habakkuk. The idea was that German torpedoes couldn't sink a giant ice cube. A small prototype was actually built in Canada before someone realized ice melts. Generals slowly backed away from the chalkboard, refunds were issued, and the dream of a sailing iceberg quietly slid into history's freezer of bad ideas. 14. The XM-29O ICW was supposed to be the future of warfare, a smart rifle firing tiny airburst grenades over enemy heads like a sniper Santa. Soldiers got excited, the Pentagon got excited, and then someone actually weighed it. 18 pounds of pure shoulder-destroying metal. Troops basically needed a gym membership just to carry the thing. By 2004, the entire project was quietly killed, leaving behind a few prototypes and a generation of soldiers thanking the heavens they never had to lug that brick around. 15. The CIA once decided that the perfect spy was a cat. Yes, an actual house cat. They surgically implanted a microphone inside a poor kitty for Operation Acoustic Kitty, hoping it would casually eavesdrop on Soviet diplomats. The cat was released near a Russian embassy in Washington and immediately wandered into traffic where a taxi flattened it on its very first mission. Millions of dollars and years of research squished in 1 second. The CIA quietly closed the file and never spoke of Whiskers again. 16. In 1862, the U.S. Navy proudly launched the USS Alligator, its very first submarine. She was a tiny iron tube powered by oars and crew hopes. Before she could even fight a single battle, the Navy decided to tow her down to South Carolina. A massive storm hit, the tow line snapped, and the Alligator vanished into the deep Atlantic forever. Sailors stood on deck watching their pioneering submarine disappear into waves. To this day, nobody knows where she rests, probably embarrassed at the bottom. 17. Picture a tiny fighter jet shaped like an egg, dangling inside the belly of a giant B-36 bomber. That was the XF-85 Goblin, America's parasite fighter experiment. Pilots could drop out of the mothership and zoom around defending the bomber. The problem was actually getting back inside. Pilots hooked onto a trapeze bar mid-air and most missed, sometimes spectacularly. After a few terrifying near-death dangles, the Navy quietly canceled the Goblin. Test pilots reportedly celebrated with stiff drinks and shaking hands afterwards. 18. The Dardic Tround pistol was a weird little firearm that ditched normal bullets for triangle-shaped plastic ammo. Yes, triangular bullets. Inventor David Dardic swore this was the future and even built a working prototype. Shooters tried it, looked at the strange triangle rounds, and slowly handed it back. The whole concept felt like geometry homework with gunpowder. By 1962, production stopped, the Trounds vanished, and the Dardic became a collector's oddity. Today, gun nerds still pull them out and ask their friends, "What shape is this?" 19. In 1918, American gun genius John Pedersen secretly designed a magical device that could turn the bolt-action Springfield rifle into a semi-automatic pistol shooter. The Army loved it so much they built 65,000 of them in total secrecy. Then World War I ended and somebody thought, well, now what? The devices were quietly stored, forgotten, and finally destroyed in 1931. Generations of gun collectors weep at this loss. Only a handful survived and they cost a fortune at auctions today. 20. The Davis gun was an aerial cannon with a hilarious solution to recoil. It fired lead pellets backwards out of its rear while the cannonball flew forwards, basically canceling out the kick. Mounted on World War I biplanes, it was genius until you realized the lead pellets had to go somewhere. Sometimes the somewhere was the tail of your own plane. Pilots developed quick necks from checking behind themselves constantly. The Davis gun eventually retired, and biplane tails everywhere collectively breathed a sigh of relief. 21. During World War II, British and American planners cooked up Operation Vegetarian, possibly the silliest named weapon ever. The plan was to airdrop millions of cattle cakes laced with anthrax over German farmland to poison their cows. Yes, killer biscuits for cattle. 5 million deadly snacks were actually produced and sat stockpiled, waiting for cows to chew them into oblivion. Thankfully, the war ended before any cake fell. Officials quietly burned every single one, and German cows lived happily ever after, completely unaware. 22. The MGM-134. Midgetman sounded like a circus act, but was actually a road-mobile nuclear missile launched from giant off-road trucks. The Air Force basically wanted to drive nukes around random highways like a deadly food truck. $4 billion later in 1992, somebody finally asked if this was really necessary. The whole program got canceled, the trucks got reassigned, and the Midget Man vanished into history. Somewhere a general is still annoyed he never got to drive his rolling apocalypse around Nevada. 23. Soldiers in 1942 watched in disbelief as engineers unveiled the Christie M1919 amphibious tank, a vehicle that could swim across rivers and drive onto beaches like a metal turtle. Inventor Walter Christie believed his floating tank would revolutionize warfare forever. American generals took one look at his swimming contraption and politely declined, choosing traditional tanks instead. The Soviets, however, happily borrowed Christie's designs and built thousands. Walter died bitter and broke while watching foreign armies use his ideas. The Christie tank vanished from American memory, leaving behind one heartbroken inventor. 24. Imagine an 800-foot Navy airship floating through the sky, launching biplanes from its belly like an aerial pirate ship. That was the USS Akron, America's flying aircraft carrier. Pilots would zoom out, fight imaginary enemies, then hook back onto the airship like circus performers. In 1933, a storm hit the Akron off the Jersey coast and crashed it into the Atlantic, killing 73 crew members. The Navy quietly admitted maybe giant flammable sky carriers were not their brightest idea ever. 25. In 1947, Northrop unveiled the YB-49, a flying wing bomber decades ahead of its time, and basically the grandfather of modern stealth. It looked like a giant boomerang gliding through clouds. The problem was that it wobbled like a drunk uncle every time pilots tried to drop bombs accurately. After several embarrassing test flights and one fatal crash, the Air Force pulled the plug. Northrop engineers wept into their drafting tables. Decades later, the B-2 Spirit finally proved they were right all along. 26. The Vandenberg volley gun crammed 85 musket barrels into one giant 400-pound chunk of metal misery. Pull the trigger once and unleash a wall of lead, then enjoy the next 10 minutes reloading every single barrel by hand. Civil War soldiers tried it, sweated profusely, and slowly walked away. It was less of a weapon and more of a paperweight with attitude. The Vandenberg saw almost no combat and vanished into museum basements, where it probably still judges visitors silently from behind glass. 27. In 1916, the Holt 75 land battleship looked like somebody crossed a tractor with a pirate ship and gave it cannons. American engineers proudly called it an early tank prototype. It rolled around with side-mounted guns, terrifying nobody because it could barely move uphill. Soldiers reportedly outpaced it while walking casually. The Holt 75 was abandoned for actual working tanks shortly after testing. Today, only black and white photos remain, capturing a machine that looked simultaneously menacing and totally embarrassing at the same time. 28. Project Pluto was basically a nuclear-powered cruise missile designed to fly forever while spewing deadly radiation along its entire flight path. The plan was for it to roar over enemy territory, poisoning everything below before crashing somewhere even more catastrophic. Engineers tested the ramjet engine successfully, and then somebody finally asked if making a permanent flying Chernobyl was really our best option. Common sense briefly visited the Pentagon, and the project got canceled. Pluto faded away, leaving everyone slightly relieved the world dodged a bullet. 29. In 1954, the CIA decided to weaponize fleas, because apparently bullets were just too straightforward. Project Big Itch tested releasing 200,000 fleas from aircraft to bite enemy soldiers and spread diseases. Spies giggled, scientists scratched their heads, and somewhere a flea trainer probably questioned his life choices. The fleas would supposedly drop in tiny canisters and explode into itchy clouds. The tests sort of worked, the fleas sort of cooperated, and the project quietly vanished. Today's CIA pretends Big Itch never happened. 30. In 1900, the Navy bought the USS Holland 6 for $150,000, and America's entire modern submarine fleet basically started with this one little iron pickle. Inventor John Holland had been begging the Navy to take submarines seriously for decades, while officials laughed him off. Once they finally bought one, suddenly submarines were the coolest thing ever. The Holland 6 served loyally, trained crews, and eventually retired. Every American submarine today traces its lineage back to this stubborn little vessel that refused to be ignored. 31. Rubber aircraft sounds like a joke, but Goodyear actually built one called the inflatable that you literally pumped up like a beach toy. The plan was to drop these deflated planes behind enemy lines so downed pilots could inflate them and fly home. Crews stared at the bouncy contraption, wondering if this was serious or some elaborate prank. One bullet would obviously pop the whole thing instantly. After several head-scratching tests, the Pentagon quietly deflated the project, leaving engineers to face uncomfortable questions about life choices. 32. Imagine being a brilliant rifle and getting rejected at the absolute last second. That happened to the T-48, basically an American-built FNFAL that was about to become the standard U.S. battle rifle. Soldiers tested it, loved it, and assumed it would win. Then, in 1957, the Pentagon switched gears and grabbed the M14 instead. Belgian engineers reportedly threw their pencils across the room in frustration. Decades later, Americans watched the rest of the world happily using FAL rifles and wondered what could have been. 33. Way ahead of its time, the Confederate Williams rapid-fire gun cranked out 65 rounds per minute back in the 1860s, which felt like pure witchcraft to soldiers. Only 42 were ever built before the South ran out of money, metal, and luck. Troops who saw it in action stood there blinking, unsure if it was genius or cursed by demons. Union soldiers who captured a few just scratched their heads. Today, only a handful remain, sitting silently in museums collecting dust and admiration from gun nerds. 34. Some genius in World War I looked at a flatbed truck and asked the magic question, what if we just bolt a 75mm cannon to it? That bizarre idea became the Liberty truck gun, the world's very first self-propelled artillery piece. Soldiers cheered because dragging cannons through mud with horses was officially over. The truck rolled around Europe, terrifying enemies and amusing allies. After the war, it returned to civilian work, but its goofy genius inspired every modern self-propelled artillery system in existence. 35. Old B-17 bombers stuffed with 20,000 pounds of explosives and flown remotely into German bunkers. What could possibly go wrong? Project Aphrodite tried it anyway, and tragically, Joseph Kennedy Jr., the older brother of future President JFK, died when his flying bomb exploded prematurely over England in 1944. The whole program kept failing spectacularly, with planes detonating too early. Aphrodite was quietly cancelled, leaving behind grief and a younger Kennedy, who would later become one of America's most famous presidents instead. 36. Flying at Mach 3 at 70,000 feet, the XB-70 Valkyrie was basically a Lamborghini with wings designed to outrun Soviet missiles forever. Pilots adored screaming through skies in this gorgeous white beast. Then, in 1966, a chase plane stupidly drifted too close during a photo shoot, clipped the Valkyrie's wing, and sent both crashing down in flames. The entire program died right there because of a publicity stunt gone horribly wrong. Generals wept openly, photographers got blamed forever, and the Valkyrie vanished into aviation legend. 37. Reagan dreamed of thousands of tiny space interceptors zooming down to smash Soviet nukes, charmingly named Brilliant Pebbles. The Strategic Defense Initiative promised America an invisible space shield against nuclear Armageddon, and movie fans loved it. Engineers, however, struggled with annoying things called physics and budgets. By 1993, the whole Pebble parade got quietly cancelled with nothing to show for billions spent. Today, the only brilliant pebbles in space are random asteroids minding their own business, laughing at the Pentagon for ever trying this nonsense. 38. History was made in 1864 when the CSS Hunley became the first combat submarine ever to sink an enemy warship. Confederate sailors celebrated this revolutionary achievement, then watched in horror as the Hunley mysteriously sank itself moments later, killing all 8 crew members aboard. Nobody knows exactly what happened. Maybe water flooded in, maybe the explosion damaged her hull, maybe the ocean was just feeling spiteful that day. The submarine vanished for over a century until being raised in 2000, still keeping all her secrets locked tight. 39. Picture an actual nuclear reactor humming away inside an airplane flying over America. The Convair NB-36 Crusader did exactly that in the 1950s, completing 89 test flights with a real working reactor on board. Pilots wore lead-lined suits, ground crews kept their distance, and small towns below remained blissfully unaware they had a flying Chernobyl overhead. Somebody finally realized that crashing nuclear airplanes might be terrible for civilians and pets alike. The program quietly ended, and pilots celebrated by never glowing in the dark again. 40. 6 guns in one box sounds like fantasy, but the Stoner 63 actually did it. By swapping parts like military Legos, this modular weapon transformed into rifles, machine guns, and everything in between. Navy SEALs absolutely worshipped it during Vietnam, calling it the ultimate combat tool. The Army, however, looked at all those loose parts and said absolutely not. Despite SEAL pleas and excellent battlefield performance, the Stoner 63 got cancelled. Today, collectors fight over the few survivors floating around, paying fortunes for these mechanical unicorns. 41. Abraham Lincoln himself attended a demonstration in 1862 and got so impressed by the Agar coffee mill gun that he personally ordered 10 units on the spot. The contraption literally looked like a giant coffee grinder, with soldiers cranking a handle while pre-loaded steel tubes dropped from a hopper. Troops in the field called it adorable but unreliable. Barrels overheated quickly, and jams happened constantly. Lincoln's caffeine-themed killing machine vanished after the war, leaving behind only confused historians and museum visitors asking why anyone weaponized breakfast. 42. Sailors during World War I suddenly noticed a strange new gadget bolted to their destroyers called the Y-gun, shaped exactly like the letter Y for obvious reasons. This weird thing flung depth charges sideways off the deck like exploding tennis balls. German U-boat captains absolutely despised it because explosions now came from random angles instead of just behind ships. The Y-gun saved countless lives and ruined plenty of submarines. Eventually, newer launchers replaced it, but sailors always saluted the boom-heavy legacy of this oddball. 43. Long before drones ever existed, America created the Bat in 1945, a radar-guided glide bomb that became the first true smart weapon in history. Bombers dropped it over Pacific waters, and the Bat used its little radar brain to actively hunt Japanese ships completely on its own. Sailors below probably wondered why a bomb was thinking. It actually sank multiple enemy vessels, proving smart weapons worked beautifully. After the war, it was forgotten, yet every modern guided bomb traces its origins back to this clever ancestor. 44. A reusable military spaceplane in the 1960s sounds like pure science fiction, yet that is exactly what the Boeing X-20 dinosaur was supposed to be. Pilots trained extensively, hardware was nearly finished, and excitement inside the Pentagon was sky-high. Then, in 1963, somebody declared the program too expensive, and the entire thing got canceled mere moments before launch. Test pilots stood around with nothing to fly and broken dreams. Decades later, America built the space shuttle, but the original spaceplane dream stayed buried. 45? Q fever sounds like something from a comic book, yet America actually weaponized this nasty disease at Fort Detrick during the Cold War. Scientists genuinely cultivated barrels of biological horror, ready to unleash on enemies if needed. Soldiers walked around the facility wearing serious faces and serious protective gear. Then, in 1973, President Nixon signed an executive order that wiped out every single stockpile. Scientists watched years of creepy work get destroyed. Q-fever weapons vanished from American arsenals, leaving behind only nervous biographers and dusty notebooks. 46. Confederates loved oddball inventions, and the CSS David proved it perfectly. This semi-submersible torpedo boat floated barely above water like a sneaky alligator, ramming Union ships with pole-mounted bombs. Union sailors would suddenly notice a tiny smokestack gliding toward them and immediately panic. The David caused real damage despite looking ridiculous. After the war, these strange boats vanished into history. Today, their oddly shaped silhouettes appear only in faded sketches and museum exhibits, reminding people that the Civil War got weirder than anyone remembers. 47. A Mach 4 fighter jet with a periscope instead of a cockpit canopy sounds impossible, yet that was actually the Republic XF-103. Engineers genuinely thought pilots could fly an interceptor while peeking through a tiny tube like submarine commanders. The plane never even reached its first test flight before being canceled. Pilots reportedly thanked every saint they knew for dodging that bullet. The XF-103 vanished into aviation history's drawer of magnificent failures. Today, only blueprints and bewildered engineers remain, asking what exactly they were thinking back then. 48. Australia happily adopted the Owen heliogun after America took one look and said nope. This bizarre 1939 weapon had a circular top-mounted magazine that made it look like a UFO landed on a rifle. Australian soldiers absolutely loved the thing in jungle warfare. American officials, however, thought it looked too weird and refused. The heliogun became Australia's secret weapon, while Americans quietly regretted their snobbery. Today, gun collectors point at this oddball and remind everyone that sometimes ugly weapons are actually brilliant inventions in disguise. 49. Confederates loved their hexagons, apparently, because they built actual polygonal cannons that fired six-sided shells designed to spin perfectly through rifled barrels. The shape sounded brilliant on paper, since the shells would supposedly fly straighter and hit harder. Real life, however, had different plans. The hex shells often wobbled, jammed, or just refused to cooperate entirely. Confederate gunners cursed loudly while reloading. After the war, these geometric oddities quietly vanished from arsenals. Today, they sit in museums looking like ammunition designed by a confused math teacher. 50. The first true assault rifle was not German, despite what everyone believes. Back in 1917, American inventor Frank Burton designed the Burton Light Machine Rifle. decades before the famous German STG-44 ever existed. The weapon fired select fire from a top-mounted magazine, basically inventing modern assault rifles. The Army politely looked at it, said maybe later, and shelved the entire concept. Burton's groundbreaking invention vanished into obscurity. Only one prototype survives today, sitting quietly at Springfield Armory while history slowly rewrites itself. 51. Walt Disney's studio engineers, the same people who designed Mickey Mouse, actually helped create a 4,500-pound rocket-assisted bunker buster called the Disney Bomb. The mission was simple: punch holes through reinforced German U-boat pens that regular bombs bounced off like marshmallows. Disney engineers traded animation desks for blueprints, designing this monster with cartoon-level enthusiasm. Bombers dropped them in 1945, and the results were mixed at best. After the war, the Disney Bomb quietly retired, becoming the strangest collaboration between animation and warfare ever recorded. 52. Pilots who flew the Lockheed XF-51 Pogo deserved medals just for showing up. This bizarre fighter took off vertically while sitting on its tail like a pencil balanced on a desk. Landing was even worse, since pilots had to fly backwards using periscopes to see the ground behind them. Test pilots reportedly developed serious neck cramps and existential dread. The Navy eventually realized this was completely insane and quietly canceled the program. The Pogo vanished into history, leaving behind grateful pilots who never had to fly tail first again. 53. Long before modern IEDs ever existed, Confederate General Gabriel Rains invented the land torpedo, basically a landmine triggered by tripwires hidden in roads and forests. Union soldiers got blown sky-high constantly, and General Sherman absolutely hated these things, calling them barbaric and unfair. Rains shrugged and kept planting more. After the Civil War, the land torpedo faded from American arsenals, but the concept spread worldwide and never truly disappeared. Today, every modern IED basically owes its existence to this grouchy Southern engineer. 54. The Walker Colt revolver of 1847 was so absurdly powerful that it routinely exploded in the hands of its users. Texas Rangers loved the massive recoil and stopping power, but the guns themselves had a nasty habit of self-destructing during firing. Only 1,100 were ever made before Colt politely backed off this dangerous design. Owners reportedly carried spare hands just in case. Today, surviving Walker Colts sell for absolute fortunes at auctions, beloved by collectors who admire them safely behind glass instead of actually firing them. 55. Hydrogen-filled zeppelins floating ominously over Britain needed something special to bring them down, so American engineers cooked up the Pomeroy incendiary bullet during World War I. These nasty little rounds were designed to ignite hydrogen on contact, turning massive zeppelins into spectacular sky fireballs. The bullets worked terrifyingly well. After the war, international treaties banned them entirely for being too cruel. The Pomeroy vanished into history, leaving behind only flaming Zeppelin memories and uncomfortable diplomats trying to forget what they had unleashed upon the skies. 56. Destroyers hunting submarines got a brilliant new toy called the Hedgehog, an anti-submarine mortar that fired 24 contact bombs in a perfect circle ahead of the ship. Unlike depth charges that exploded on timers, Hedgehog bombs only detonated when they actually hit something solid like a U-boat. German submarine captains absolutely hated this thing because it announced its arrival with terrifying accuracy. The Hedgehog saved countless Allied ships during World War II. Newer weapons eventually replaced it, but submarine crews everywhere still remember its prickly legacy. 57. During a congressional demo in 1982, the M247 Sergeant York DVAD anti-aircraft system embarrassed itself spectacularly by locking its radar onto a nearby latrine fan instead of the actual target. Politicians watched in horror as billions of taxpayer dollars aimed itself at a bathroom. The system also locked onto reviewing stands and grandstands holding generals. After this disaster, the Pentagon quietly killed the entire program. The Sergeant York became a permanent punchline, reminding everyone that defense contractors sometimes built very expensive ways to threaten bathroom equipment instead. 58. JFK personally canceled the AGM-48 Skybolt in 1962. And the decision nearly caused a major diplomatic meltdown with Britain. The Skybolt was an air-launched ballistic missile fired from bombers, basically nuclear weapons launched from airplane bellies. The British had bet their entire nuclear strategy on the Skybolt and were furious when Kennedy pulled the plug. Frantic phone calls flew across the Atlantic. Eventually, America offered Britain the Polaris missile as consolation, and the alliance survived. The Skybolt vanished, but the diplomatic drama remained legendary forever. 59. Mountain warfare needed flexible artillery, so the U.S. Army created the mountain howitzer M1841, a cannon that broke down into pieces and rode on two mules through impossible terrain. Soldiers could reassemble the entire thing in just 60 seconds and start firing. Mules carried the parts uphill while gunners followed, sweating profusely. This little howitzer fought in Mexican wars, Civil War battles, and frontier skirmishes. Eventually, heavier modern artillery replaced it, but those clever mountain mules earned permanent respect for hauling cannons up places horses refused to go. 60. Some engineer in World War I looked at one cannon and asked the wild question, what if we welded three together? The result was the triplex cannon, 3 barrels fused into one massive firing system meant to unleash hell in a single shot. On its very first test firing, the triple cannon promptly shattered itself into spectacular pieces. Engineers stood there blinking at the wreckage. The triplex cannon was quickly forgotten, becoming a permanent reminder that sometimes more barrels just means more dramatic ways for things to break catastrophically. 61. Television cameras stuffed inside bombs sounded futuristic in 1944, but the Pratt Reed GB-1 glide bomb actually did it. American pilots dropped these remote-controlled flying bombs and watched grainy black and white footage stream back from the nose camera, steering them like world's most expensive video game. The setup was clunky, the signal often failed, and pilots sometimes flew their bombs into trees by accident. Despite the chaos, the GB-1 inspired modern guided weapons. After the war, this television-obsessed bomb vanished into Pentagon storage rooms forever. 62. Hiding 50 nuclear missiles aboard disguised commercial trains sounds like a Hollywood movie plot. Yet the MX Peacekeeper rail garrison plan was deadly serious. The idea was to randomly shuffle nukes around American railroads, pretending to be ordinary freight, making Soviet targeting impossible. Engineers actually built prototypes and tested the concept. Then the Cold War politely ended in 1991, and suddenly nobody needed nuclear hide-and-seek anymore. The whole rail nuke parade got canceled, leaving behind blueprints and very confused railroad executives wondering what just happened. 63. Seals attaching magnetic mines to enemy ship hulls sounds like a children's cartoon, yet the U.S. Navy genuinely tested it. Trained SEALs would supposedly swim up to anchored vessels, slap magnetic explosives onto the hull, then casually return for fish snacks. The SEALs were enthusiastic but had absolutely no concept of operational security. They got distracted, played games, and sometimes lost the mines entirely. The Navy quietly admitted that SEALs make terrible saboteurs and ended the program. Today, the SEALs probably tell their grandkids legendary spy stories. 64. Only 3 Pancor jackhammer combat shotguns exist in the entire world, making them the rarest American firearms ever built. This 12-gauge automatic monster loaded shells in a rotating drum and could blast through doors like they were paper. Gun nerds worshipped the design, the military politely declined, and funding dried up before mass production began. The 3 surviving prototypes now live in secret collections, occasionally appearing in video games to torment players who can never own one. The jackhammer became a legend through sheer scarcity. 65. 10 engines on a single airplane sounds absolutely ridiculous. Yet the Convair B-36 Peacemaker actually had exactly that, with 6 pusher propellers plus 4 jet engines hanging underneath. This monstrous beast was the largest bomber ever built, requiring entire crews just to manage all the moving parts. The catch was simple: by the time it entered service, jet bombers had already made it obsolete. Pilots loved flying this engineering disaster anyway. After a few years of service, the Peacemaker retired peacefully into Aviation Museum legend. 66. A .22 caliber rifle issued to grown soldiers sounds laughable. But the Springfield M1922 served exactly that role in the 1920s as a training weapon. Soldiers learned marksmanship by plinking with these dainty little rifles before graduating to real combat guns. The whole program felt like military summer camp. By 1936, the Army quietly removed them, replacing the M1922 with more practical training methods. Today, these forgotten rifles occasionally appear at gun shows, where collectors smile and remember when soldiers practiced shooting with glorified squirrel guns. 67. 25 barrels stuffed into one giant covered bridge gun sounds insane. Yet the Billinghurst Requa battery actually did it during the Civil War. Soldiers pulled a single trigger and unleashed 25 rounds simultaneously, terrifying Confederates at the Siege of Petersburg. Loading the thing took forever, which kind of defeated the purpose. Still, when it worked, the Requa battery created an absolute storm of lead. After the war, this strange contraption vanished into history. Today, only a few survive, looking like medieval weapons crossed with garden plumbing. 68. Before radar ever existed, soldiers wore giant acoustic horns strapped to their heads to detect incoming enemy aircraft. These bizarre sound locators of World War I looked like enormous metal ears stuck onto helmets. Soldiers stood around listening intently, occasionally pointing dramatically at the sky when they heard engines approaching. The system actually worked surprisingly well until airplanes started flying faster than sound could warn anyone. Radar eventually made these contraptions hilariously obsolete. Photos of these listening soldiers remain among the funniest military images ever captured. 69. Lockheed designed a single-engine fighter called the CL-1200 Lancer, meant to replace the famous F-104 Starfighter. The Pentagon actually signed contracts, money changed hands, and excitement was real. Then somehow the whole project just stopped, with not a single Lancer ever rolling off the assembly line. Engineers stared at blueprints wondering what happened. Today, the CL-1200 exists only in concept drawings and frustrated aviation memories. It became one of those weird American weapons that almost existed but somehow evaporated into bureaucratic mystery instead. 70. A cruise missile vanishing during a 1958 test sounds bad, but finding it decades later in Brazil sounds like a sitcom plot. The Snark was a transcontinental nuclear delivery system, basically a jet-powered missile meant to fly across continents. During one test flight, the missile got bored, wandered off course, and disappeared completely. Years later, jungle explorers in Brazil stumbled onto the rusting wreckage of America's lost nuke carrier. The Snark earned the nickname Snark-Infested Waters because nobody could keep track of these things. 71. Sergeant Ezra Lee climbed into a wooden barrel-shaped contraption called the American Turtle in 1776 and tried to drill a mine into the bottom of the British warship HMS Eagle. This bizarre submersible was the very first combat submarine in history, powered entirely by hand cranks and pure revolutionary determination. Lee paddled underwater for hours, but his drill kept slipping off the copper hull. He eventually gave up and floated away exhausted. The Turtle never sank anything, yet it earned its place as America's first underwater warfighter. 72. Long before the famous V-22 Osprey ever existed, the Bell X-53 was already doing tilt-rotor magic in the 1950s. This funky little aircraft had rotors that swiveled from helicopter mode to airplane mode mid-flight, which freaked out everyone watching. Pilots reportedly held their breath every time the rotors started rotating sideways. After completing only 60 hours of flight time, the program was abandoned, leaving the tilt-rotor dream parked in a hangar. Decades later, the Osprey finally proved the X-53 had been right all along. 73. Secret stealth fighters in the 1970s sounded like spy movie nonsense, yet the Have Blue prototype actually existed and looked completely insane. This faceted, angular black aircraft was the secret grandfather of the F-117 stealth fighter, designed to be invisible to radar. Engineers built two prototypes and proudly tested them. Then, both prototypes crashed spectacularly during testing, because making aircraft invisible apparently makes them harder to fly properly. The lessons learned from those crashes eventually birthed the F-117, proving sometimes you have to crash before you can hide. 74. 2300. Seventh-day Adventist volunteers signed up for Project Whitecoat between 1954 and 1973, agreeing to be deliberately exposed to live germ warfare agents by the U.S. Army. These religious soldiers refused combat duty but accepted being human test subjects for biological weapons research. Scientists watched closely as volunteers caught engineered diseases for science. Most thankfully survived, becoming walking medical anomalies for decades. The project was eventually shut down quietly. Today, these volunteers are remembered as some of the bravest weird heroes America never properly thanked. 75. Charleston Harbor witnessed an embarrassing moment when the Confederate Iron Battery, a floating ironclad gun platform, simply sank in its own home port during a winter storm. The whole point of building this thing was to defend the harbor and look terrifying to Union ships. Instead, it just glubbed beneath the waves while sailors watched in disbelief. Confederate officers reportedly stood there speechless, watching their expensive metal monster disappear without firing a single meaningful shot in combat. The Iron Battery vanished into history's longest list of nautical embarrassments. 76. Wild geometric stripes painted across World War I ships sounds like an art school project, yet Dazzle Camouflage was genuine military genius. Instead of hiding ships, these crazy patterns confused German U-boat rangefinders, making it nearly impossible to calculate distance and speed accurately. Ships looked like floating Picasso paintings sailing across the Atlantic. U-boat captains squinted through periscopes and frequently missed shots. After the war, naval painters returned to boring gray, but Dazzle remains the only time abstract art legitimately saved sailor lives across an entire ocean. 77. A 10-foot-long rocket weighing 1,200 pounds strapped to a fighter plane sounds like a death sentence. Yet Corsair pilots in 1945 happily fired the Tiny Tim rocket at Japanese bunkers. The name was hilariously ironic given the rocket's enormous size. Pilots had to release Tiny Tim carefully because the rocket's exhaust could damage their own aircraft if launched wrong. When it hit a bunker, the explosion was devastating. After the war, Tiny Tim faded away, becoming yet another oddly named weapon nobody discusses at dinner parties. 78. A jet fighter taking off from open ocean using retractable hydrofoil skis sounds completely insane. Yet the Convair F-2Y Sea Dart actually did exactly that. Only 5 were ever built, and pilots reported the ride felt like riding a jet ski strapped to a missile. One prototype broke apart spectacularly during a 1954 demonstration, killing the pilot in front of a horrified crowd. The Navy quietly canceled the program shortly after. The Sea Dart became a strange footnote in aviation history, proving water-based jet fighters were a wonderfully terrible idea. 79. Smith & Wesson built rifles for British troops in 1940, but the light rifle Mark I was such a disaster that only 1,227 were ever produced before being completely scrapped. British soldiers reportedly took one look at these awkward rifles and politely asked for refunds. The rifles jammed, broke, and frustrated everyone who touched them. Smith & Wesson lost serious money on the project. Today, these failed rifles are extremely rare collector items, valued precisely because they were terrible weapons that nobody wanted to use. 80. The USS Tang met a tragic end when its own Mark XIV submarine torpedo malfunctioned during World War II and circled back, sinking the very submarine that had just fired it. American torpedoes were notoriously unreliable, often running in circles like confused fish instead of hitting enemy targets. Captain Richard O'Kane and a few survivors watched helplessly as their own weapon destroyed them. The Tang disaster forced the Navy to finally fix the Mark XIV's many problems. Until then, American torpedoes had basically been swimming suicide notes. 81. Tons of tiny finned steel darts dropped from high-altitude planes sounds like medieval warfare, yet the Lazy Dog bomb did exactly that in the 1950s. These unguided projectiles would rain down on enemy positions at terminal velocity, punching through helmets and vehicles like deadly metal confetti. The fatal flaw was simple: pilots had absolutely no way to aim them properly. Whatever happened to be underneath got destroyed, friend or foe. The Pentagon eventually realized random murder from the sky was bad strategy, and the Lazy Dog quietly disappeared from arsenals. 82. Pilots flying the Lockheed YF-12 in 1968 became the fastest fighter jet operators in human history, hitting Mach 3.35 regularly. This sleek black beast was basically an interceptor version of the legendary SR-71 Blackbird. Engineers expected it to dominate the skies for decades. Then, Pentagon accountants realized that ground-based radar interceptors were way cheaper than million-dollar speed demons. The YF-12 got canceled despite breaking every aviation record around. Today, its few prototypes sit silently in museums, still holding speed records nobody has ever beaten. 83. Long before John Moses Browning became America's most famous gun designer, his dad, Jonathan Browning, invented the wonderfully weird harmonica gun. This pistol had a sliding horizontal magazine that held up to 10 cartridges, which the shooter manually pushed sideways to reload. The whole thing genuinely looked like somebody was playing a musical harmonica during gunfights. The design was clever but slow and clunky. Eventually, revolvers made it obsolete, but Browning Sr.'s musical pistol earned him a permanent spot in American firearms history forever. 84. A giant four-engine seaplane patrol bomber called the Covert Tradewind XP-5Y had one tiny problem. The propellers kept shredding themselves during testing. Engineers watched in horror as million-dollar engines disintegrated into expensive metal confetti. The plane was supposed to dominate ocean patrol missions, but it spent most of its time being repaired instead of flying. After repeated propeller catastrophes, the Navy quietly walked away from the entire program. The Tradewind vanished into aviation oblivion, leaving behind grumpy mechanics and a generation of wasted propeller blades. 85. Astronauts had already been selected and hardware was nearly complete when the Manned Orbiting Laboratory got canceled just weeks before launch in 1969. This secret space station was supposed to orbit Earth, photographing Soviet bases like a giant James Bond gadget floating overhead. Then somebody pointed out that robotic satellites could spy just as well without needing expensive humans or oxygen tanks. The whole program died overnight. Several grounded astronauts later flew space shuttle missions instead, while the orbital spy station became NASA's saddest canceled adventure ever. 86. Shooting around corners without exposing yourself sounds like a video game cheat code, yet the US tested an actual curved barrel weapon called the T-17. Soldiers would point this oddly bent rifle around walls and somehow fire at enemies hiding behind cover. The concept worked occasionally, but accuracy was absolutely terrible. Bullets sometimes traveled in genuinely unpredictable directions, including back toward the shooter. The Army politely declined to adopt this corner-shooting nightmare. The T-17 vanished into prototype warehouses, where it probably still bends sadly in the dark. 87. Lockheed spent $7 billion and 22 years developing the AH-56 Cheyenne attack helicopter, and the final result was exactly 0 delivered helicopters. The Cheyenne was supposed to be the ultimate gunship, faster and more lethal than anything ever flown. Endless delays, technical problems, and political fighting kept pushing the program backwards. By 1972, the Army finally gave up and canceled everything. Generals looked at the empty hangars and $7 billion worth of nothing. The Cheyenne became one of military history's most expensive failures ever. 88. A bouncing bomb that skipped across water like a stone toward enemy ships sounds insane. Yet the highball was real and stayed classified until 2017. American pilots dropped these spinning bombs that would hop across the ocean surface before slamming into Japanese warships. The technology had originally inspired the famous British dam-busters raid. Then America built its own version and never used it operationally before the war ended. Highball stayed locked in secret files for over 70 years, finally getting declassified so historians could enjoy the absurdity. 89. Operators of the XM214 microgun could unleash 4,000 rounds per minute of pure devastation, but only for 60 glorious seconds before the barrels melted into useless slag. This tiny minigun looked like the perfect weapon until engineers realized continuous fire turned it into molten soup. The Army took one look and politely passed on this self-destructing superweapon. Several attempts to fix the overheating problem all failed embarrassingly. The microgun vanished into prototype storage, occasionally appearing in action movies where physics never applies, and barrels somehow never melt dramatically. 90. Lieutenant William Cushing pulled off one of the craziest naval attacks in 1864 by ramming the Confederate ironclad CSS Albemarle with a spar torpedo, basically a bomb on the end of a long stick. Cushing rowed a tiny boat directly at the massive ironclad while Confederate sailors fired at him desperately. He shoved the bomb under the hull, detonated it, and somehow swam away alive while his entire crew died or got captured. The Albemarle sank instantly. Cushing became a Civil War legend overnight, deservedly so. 91. A top-secret torpedo so important the Navy hid its real identity inside official paperwork by calling it the Mark 24 mine. The Mark 24 Fido was actually World War II's first acoustic homing torpedo. Submarines and aircraft dropped these clever fish that listened for enemy propellers and chased them like underwater bloodhounds. German U-boats had no idea what hit them, since Fido arrived silently and patiently. Sailors loved the disguise name, joking that mines do not usually swim toward targets. Fido sank dozens of U-boats before quietly disappearing into classified files. 92. Both prototypes of the Republic XF-91 Thunderceptor existed in extremely small numbers, since only 2 were ever built before the Air Force decided this strange creation was too weird to continue. The jet had both regular jet engines and rocket engines bolted on, giving pilots the option of normal flight or sudden insane acceleration. Test pilots reportedly loved the rocket boost but feared everything else about the design. Engineers also struggled with the bizarre forward-swept wings. The Thunderceptor vanished quickly, becoming aviation history's strangest hybrid that nobody asked for. 93. Live nuclear tests inside the atmosphere with actual humans nearby sounds insane today. Yet in 1957, the U.S. Navy fired Project Genie, an unguided air-to-air nuclear rocket, during a real interceptor exercise. 5 volunteer officers stood directly below the detonation just to prove the radiation was safe. The blast lit up the sky beautifully while the officers grinned for cameras. Decades later, most of them developed mysterious cancers and other health problems. Project Genie disappeared from active service, leaving behind glowing memories and uncomfortable medical questions. 94. Paper parachute fuses sound flimsy and unreliable, yet the Liberty aerial bomb of World War I actually used them, dropped from giant balloons floating above battlefields. Most of these bombs failed spectacularly upon impact, refusing to detonate after their long balloon ride down. Soldiers below would watch ominous shapes descend and then nervously approach the unexploded duds afterward. The whole program was an embarrassing waste of resources. Eventually, the military gave up entirely on aerial balloon bombing. The Liberty aerial bomb floated quietly into history's collection of failed bright ideas. 95. Active denial system sounds like a vending machine that refuses snacks. Yet in 2010, it was actually deployed as a real pain ray designed to scatter crowds with invisible burning sensations. The device blasted electromagnetic waves that made human skin feel like it was instantly catching fire. Soldiers tested it and described the feeling as truly terrible. Within just 1 month of deployment, the system was quietly recalled because its effects too closely resembled a really bad sunburn. The Pentagon admitted maybe weaponized sunburns were not the answer. 96. Lockheed engineers genuinely believed they could build a vertical takeoff fighter jet, and the XV-4 Hummingbird was their ambitious attempt. Both prototypes crashed during testing, killing pilots and embarrassing executives in spectacular fashion. The plane was supposed to lift off straight up like a hummingbird and zoom away horizontally, but instead, it kept finding creative new ways to fail mid-air. The program ended completely in 1969, after the second fatal crash. The Hummingbird vanished into Lockheed's drawer of regrettable concepts, where it still rests with company therapists nearby. 97. Smart grenade launchers that fire airburst rounds over enemy walls sound like the future of warfare. Yet the XM-25 Punisher was pulled from Afghanistan in 2013 after malfunctioning embarrassingly during actual combat. Soldiers loaded programmed distance rounds that were supposed to detonate above hidden enemies. Instead, the system often refused to work, exploded incorrectly, or just plainly failed. After one particularly bad incident, The Army yanked every unit out of the war zone. The Punisher became more punishment than Punisher, retiring quietly into another expensive Pentagon failure. 98. Covert engineers proudly designed the RB-58 Hustler to drop its own external fuel tank as a nuclear bomb, which sounded brilliant until somebody actually thought about it. Crews realized the explosion would happen way too close to their own aircraft, potentially turning the bomber into expensive radioactive confetti. Pilots reportedly stared at the briefing slides in disbelief. The whole concept got abandoned quickly, with the Hustler retiring far sooner than planned. The RB-58 vanished into aviation history, mostly remembered for being the bomber that nearly nuked itself constantly. 99. $33 million spent on prototypes, and the XM8 lightweight rifle still got cancelled in 2005, despite being tested as a replacement for the iconic M16. Soldiers actually liked the XM8 during trials, calling it modern and easy to use. Pentagon politics, however, killed the program through bureaucratic infighting between contractors. The rifle vanished overnight, leaving behind angry engineers and confused soldiers wondering what just happened. Today, the XM8 exists only in collector circles and online forums where gun enthusiasts still mourn its mysteriously sudden corporate murder. 100. 4,000 horsepower of pure American fury, the Goodyear. F-2G Super Corsair was designed specifically to intercept Japanese kamikaze pilots before they crashed into Navy ships. Engineers strapped the biggest engine they could find onto a regular Corsair frame and unleashed this beast. Pilots reportedly loved the insane acceleration, calling it the closest thing to riding a rocket with wings. Then, World War II ended before any Super Corsairs ever saw combat against kamikazes. The program was cancelled, and the few survivors became air race champions for decades afterward. 101. America's very first jet fighter rolled out in 1942 as the Bell P-59 Era Comet, expected to revolutionize aerial combat instantly. Pilots climbed in excitedly, fired up the futuristic jet engines, and discovered the embarrassing truth. The Era Comet was actually slower than several propeller fighters already in service. Generals quietly hid the disappointing aircraft and pretended it never happened. The P-59 was retired without ever seeing combat, becoming a footnote in jet age history. Today, it's mostly remembered as the jet fighter that lost races against grandpa airplanes. 102. Soldiers called the Browning M1895 the potato digger because its weird swinging lever underneath would literally dig into the ground if you mounted the gun too low. Imagine firing your machine gun while accidentally tilling a vegetable garden underneath. American troops dealt with this hilarious quirk for decades. Despite the gardening tendency, the gun was actually reliable and saw combat in multiple wars. Eventually, better designs replaced it, but the potato digger nickname stuck forever. Today, gun nerds still chuckle imagining cabbages sprouting beneath every active machine gun nest. 103. The CIA's heart attack gun was literally a pistol that fired frozen shellfish toxin darts so tiny that autopsies could never detect them. Targets would simply collapse from apparent heart attacks while assassins walked away unnoticed. The weapon was exposed during the 1975 Church Committee hearings, shocking senators who had no idea their own government owned murder magic. Director William Colby actually showed the gun on national television during testimony. The heart attack gun vanished from official inventory afterwards, though conspiracy theorists insist it never truly disappeared from CIA storage rooms. 104. A single live fire test was all it took to spectacularly end the U.S. Navy's Mk-50 Barracuda lightweight torpedo program. Engineers had spent years developing this clever underwater weapon, expecting smooth sailing into mass production. Then, during testing, the entire system failed so catastrophically that everyone present just stared in silent disappointment. The Navy immediately canceled everything afterwards. The Barracuda vanished into Navy storage, becoming another expensive lesson about how torpedoes hate being rushed. Today, the program exists mostly in old budget reports nobody wants to read. 105. Multiple tiny needle-like darts called flechettes, flying from a single rifle trigger, sounds futuristic. Yet Frankfurt Arsenal's salvo rifle attempted it back in the 1950s. The idea was that hitting enemies with several tiny darts simultaneously would maximize wound channels. Reality, however, delivered absolute accuracy nightmares. Flechettes scattered randomly, struck nothing intended, and confused everyone shooting them. The Army eventually abandoned the salvo concept entirely. Today, these dart-firing oddities sit in armory storage rooms, occasionally appearing at shows where collectors marvel at America's flechette-obsessed phase. 106. Only 6 examples of the Hyde Inland M2 carbine prototype survive today, making it one of the rarest American rifles ever built. Back in 1941, this design competed against the Winchester M1 carbine for the official Army contract. Winchester won decisively, and the Hyde Inland design quietly disappeared into prototype obscurity. Engineers who designed it watched their work get shelved while Winchester became famous. Today, collectors hunt desperately for those 6 survivors, paying ridiculous prices when one occasionally surfaces at auctions. The Hyde Inland became history's most beautifully forgotten loser. 107. Marines in the Pacific Theater hated the Reesing M50 submachine gun so passionately that they literally threw their issued weapons into rivers and stole Japanese rifles instead. The gun jammed constantly in jungle mud, refused to feed properly, and basically betrayed its operators at every opportunity. Imagine being a Marine watching enemies charge while your gun decides today is napping day. After enough Marines went diving for foreign weapons, the Reesing got pulled from frontline service. The M50 vanished into stateside training duty, where it could embarrass nobody. 108. 2 soldiers could carry the tiny Confederate Petersburg Coehorn mortar between them, making it perfect for cramped trench warfare in 1864. This adorable little weapon lobbed shells into Union positions during the siege of Petersburg, terrorizing troops with its compact, deadly accuracy. Confederate gunners loved being able to actually run away with their artillery after firing. After the Civil War, these portable mortars vanished from active service. Today, they occasionally appear in Civil War museums, where visitors are surprised that something this small could be such genuine military trouble. 109. Strapping explosives onto dogs and training them to run under enemy tanks sounds absolutely insane, yet World War II America actually tried it. The anti-tank dog program imagined loyal pups sprinting beneath German tanks before detonating. Unfortunately, the dogs had different plans entirely. Most trained dogs ran back toward their handlers expecting treats, occasionally with live explosives still attached. After several extremely awkward incidents, the program was quickly abandoned. American dogs everywhere collectively dodged a horrifying career path. Today, this program exists mostly as a deeply uncomfortable historical footnote. 110. Ramjet-powered missiles in 1944 sounded like pure science fiction, yet the U.S. Navy's Bumblebee project actually built working prototypes during World War II. Engineers wanted faster missiles that could intercept incoming kamikazes and bombers. The Bumblebee program eventually evolved into the famous Talos missile system that defended Navy ships for decades afterward. Original Bumblebee prototypes, meanwhile, faded into storage. Sailors who later operated Talos missiles probably had no idea their weapons descended from a wartime project named after a chubby flying insect known for stinging things. 111. The CIA's project. Cold Feet involved using aerial skyhook systems to literally yank American spies off Soviet ice stations using a balloon line snagged by a moving airplane mid-air. Agents would clip into a harness, inflate a balloon, and then pray as a passing aircraft hooked the cable and ripped them skyward. The system genuinely worked, extracting 2 agents from a Soviet Arctic station in 1962. Imagine being yanked into the sky by an airplane in the middle of frozen nowhere. Project Cold Feet vanished into spy history. Beautifully insane. And that wraps up 111 forgotten American weapons that history quietly tried to bury forever. From exploding bat squadrons to spy cats getting flattened by taxis, America has truly built some of the dumbest, weirdest, and most ridiculous weapons ever imagined. If this video made you laugh, gasp, or question every history book you ever read, then smash that like button right now. Subscribe to Dumb History so you never miss another wild ride through the strangest corners of the past. Drop a comment below telling us which weapon broke your brain the most. Was it the SEAL saboteurs, the heart attack gun, or the flying nuclear airplane? We read every single comment, so make it count. Thanks for hanging out with Dumb History today, and remember, the past was way dumber than anyone ever told you.